Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive Sports Podcast, Fantasy Football Week 1 edition. My name is Dalton Brown. I'll be your host tonight, and I am joined by the fantasy guru himself, Chris Dell. Chris, how are we feeling heading into Week 1? It's really an exciting time of year here as we record on Thursday night after Chiefs-Ravens and ahead of the weekend.
Yeah, getting really excited, man. It was a lot of fun doing our drafts. It was a lot of fun doing our season-long rankings, but it's finally time to put that all into action here. So if you check out Post-Gazette.com, I'll have my top 200 weekly rankings posted every week on the website, and they'll be releasing around the same time we do this podcast in the future. We want to get this out on Thursday morning, so we'll make sure to do that. But yeah, trying to catch up, but also trying to be strategic this week. We don't want to get too high or too low on guys compared to the opinions we created during the offseason. But, after Week 1, I think we really want to be open to changing our minds as much as humanly possible, right? Like if we can come out of Week 1 saying, you know what, 50% of my draft priors were right, I think we'll put ourselves in a good spot. So, stick to your guns in a sense, but be ready to come out of Week 1 willing to adapt, because those who don't and get stuck in the mud with past opinions are the ones who wind up getting left behind when the fantasy playoffs come around. So I'm ready to go, Don. I'm all in, man.
Yeah, I can hear the excitement in your voice, and it's a great point that you make right off the top that, Week 1 is the week really where your opinions should change the most. It's the first actual data point we have of, seeing how much target share different guys are getting, seeing how much of the load running backs are carrying, understand how much each of these quarterbacks are going to be running the football. So a lot to learn as we go into this week. If you're wondering, hey, what makes Chris Dell the fantasy guru? Obviously, Chris, he's the sports editor at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He's also a fantasy football columnist. Most impressively, Chris recently won first place out of 235 analysts at the FantasyPros Fantasy Football NFL Draft Accuracy Rankings competition. And so, look, I mean, if you're looking for a guy who understands how to evaluate players, understands how to rank players, you've come to the right place. And, really excited to dive into some Week 1 for you here, Chris. We'll start at the quarterback position. I know it's not always the most exciting fantasy position to talk about, but, there's always going to be matchups that are particularly conducive to fantasy success and others that are not so much. Looking at your rankings for this week, first thing that sticks out to me, you've got Jordan Love all the way up at number 5. That's 5 spots ahead of his ECR consensus. Talk to me about Jordan Love and some other guys who you feel especially good about this week at the quarterback position.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? And this is going to be the Friday night game in Brazil. So for those catching this podcast after the fact on Saturday or Sunday, that game will already wrapped up, and we'll see if I was right or wrong. But to me, it's all about matchups, like you said, in Week 1, right? Because Jordan Love was already a borderline top 10 ranked quarterback. And like you said, the ECR, we'll refer to that term a lot. That's the expert consensus rankings. Is essentially the close to 300 fantasy analysts that are ranking every single week on FantasyPros.com. That's where I do my rankings on and post them at the Post-Gazette website as well. And look, I've got Jordan Love number 5 this week, right? So not too crazy of a difference going from a consensus top 10 to a top 5. But to me, what makes the difference in terms of ranking him 2 spots above, for example, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, I got him 1 spot behind CJ Stroud. And to me, it's the matchup with Philly. Like, I think we can look at – and look, defenses can improve over the course of an offseason. Obviously, we'll take those data points after Week 1. But for now, we have the data points of last season. We have the data points of the offseason and training camp and free agency. And what that shows me is that Philadelphia is still a secondary one to attack through the air specifically. I think you can look at a few different secondaries where you could have said that last year. Indianapolis is one. Which is why I have Stroud ranked a couple spots ahead of consensus. The Washington Commanders were one in terms of bottom 5 secondaries to close out the year, and Philadelphia was right there with them. So I just want to use those matchups and that data that we have. Obviously, things can change, but Jordan Love has a tremendous set of weapons. Christian Watson, don't think he missed an entire practice actually during the offseason, during training camp practices. So he's ready to go, at least for now. Obviously, Romeo Doubs came on late last season. Jaden Reed going into a possible year 2 breakout You've got 2 second-year tight ends they spent early draft capital on, and Luke Musgrave, as well as Tucker Kraft. So he's got a ton of weapons at his disposal. We've got an above-average offensive line here. And another little wrinkle to throw in, Dalton, is that the other running backs behind Jacobs are all hurt. We don't even know if Emmanuel Wilson or the rookie Marshawn Lloyd are going to play Friday night. We already know A.J. Dillon, the other running back on the roster, already went on season-ending IR. So they just might be forced into dropping back and throwing a ton, regardless of what the game script dictates. And I think the matchup is there, at least on paper, to take advantage of that. So that's what those different things constitute me moving Jordan Love from a consensus QB9 in the industry to my QB5 overall for week 1.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense, and it doesn't hurt that the Packers are small underdogs in the game either from an offensive production standpoint. You figure he's going to be dropping back to pass a lot, might even be scrambling a good bit. So makes a ton of sense. As far as your thoughts on Jordan Love, looking down the list, look the 2 quarterbacks that played Thursday night. I know you're a little bit low on them, but some other guys who I think you might not quite be with consensus on. You're a little bit low on Joe Burrow in the matchup with New England. Who are some of the guys who you're maybe not so high on heading into week 1?
Yeah, I think when you look at a guy like Burrow, like I've got him 2 spots below consensus. He's still a top 10 quarterback for me. I have him QB 10. The industry has him QB 8, right? So not too much of a difference there. I'll focus on guys like 4 or 5 spots difference for me right now. 2 guys I really like. I got him as starting quarterbacks this week in fantasy are Matthew Stafford at Detroit and Baker Mayfield home against the Commanders. I mean, Baker Mayfield, very similar scenario here that we talked about with Jordan Love. The Washington Commanders were just beat up all over the secondary last season. They didn't do much to improve that group in the pass defense. So I really like Baker Mayfield bouncing back with a healthier Chris Godwin. Mike Evans continuing to do his thing. They drafted a talented rookie in the 3rd round out of Washington in Jalen McMillan, who's essentially locked up the wide receiver 3 role in Tampa. Added another talented rookie running back into the mix with Bucky Irving, another year of experience for Rashad White. So I think Baker Mayfield in Tampa's got kind of sneakily has one of the better offensive supporting cast of skill players, at least in the NFC this year, heading into week 1. And I like all those things for him, in addition to the fact that people will say, can he do it without Dave Canales? Dave Canales became the head coach of Carolina, but they brought in Liam Cohen, who has extensive experience in college, who did some really good things at Kentucky and other stops he'd been at before. So I'm going to at least put my faith that Tampa Bay can maintain what they did, especially in an extremely advantageous matchup like with the Commanders. And I would say kind of similar with Detroit. Like Detroit's offense was great last year. Their defense wasn't so great. And I think that's eventually what stunted their playoff run against the 49ers in that back and forth game. And I think we're looking at a potential shootout here in week 1 with Matthew Stafford and Jared Goff both going back and forth on a fast track in a dome. Obviously a little bit of a revenge game for Matthew Stafford here as well. Cooper Kupp fully healthy. Puka Nacua is a full go. People are worried about his health coming into week 1. So the weapons are there. The weapons are healthy. The matchup is right. These are the quarterbacks I want to bet on for some upside and possible ceiling plays, even from the traditional pocket passers like Matthew Stafford and Baker Mayfield in week 1 as well.
Yeah, and it makes a ton of sense. One thing I think people don't look at enough when it comes to fantasy football, you can learn a lot by just looking at the betting odds in a game and the game's total, right? Rams-Lions, over under 52.5 is by far the highest total on the board this week. And it makes sense with those 2 offenses and those 2 defenses playing on a fast track. So point absolutely well taken on Stafford. One other guy I want to call out looking at quarterbacks, you've got Dak Prescott all the way down at number 20 heading into week 1. I'm sure there are a lot of fantasy managers who might be starting Dak Prescott. I'm curious to hear you talk to them about why they shouldn't.
Yeah, this is a good example of, and I'll talk about the 2 guys I have back to back. Like I'm going to do what it takes if I have either Dak Prescott or Brock Purdy to bench them this week. I would say Dak Prescott specifically going up against the Browns on the road. This was, arguably the best defense in the league last season. Obviously he had Dak Prescott as CeeDee Lamb, but the other cast members around CeeDee Lamb aren't the greatest supporting crew for Dak Prescott heading into the season. So just a tough matchup for me. As you mentioned, you want to look at those point totals, whether you're looking at which quarterbacks to rank higher than the other, which kickers to rank higher than the other. We'll touch on that later in the podcast. But that's just another example there of like the Jets project to be one of the best defense in the league. So week one, what am I going to do? I'm going to downgrade Brock Purdy a little bit. I'm going to downgrade Dak Prescott, especially when you throw in the road factor there to where I'm, 4 spots lower than consensus. I have Dak Prescott at QB 19. The rest of the industry average, ECR, has him at QB 15. And on Purdy, I got Purdy at QB 21. He's consensus QB 18. So not huge differences there, but I'm going to buy into the notions of like, these are what we know about these defenses now. And until they show me otherwise, I'm going to have to continue to base my projections based off that. And those are the 2 guys. I think you probably drafted those guys to be your starter, but there may be 1 or 2 weeks where you might look to fade them. For example, like I would rather start Jared Goff, Trevor Lawrence, Tua over those guys. Caleb Williams, the rookie with the rushing upside. Those are all quarterbacks I'm far more confident in than a Dak Prescott and a Brock Purdy because of those very tough matchups they have in week 1 coming up.
Makes a ton of sense. Let's move on to running backs. Looking at your rankings for running backs, Chris, couple guys that stick out to me that I can tell you're quite a big fan of this week. James Cook, all the way up at number 7. That's 6 spots ahead of ECR consensus. And James Conner up at number 13, 5 spots ahead of ECR. Obviously those are 2 guys who are playing in the same game with Buffalo and Arizona. Talk to me about the running backs that you're most excited about this week.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it right there. I just want to be invested in that game. I mean, you look at the implied team totals for week 1. The Buffalo Bills are second in the league at 27 points, right? We mentioned that Rams-Lions game is one to attack. The Lions are number 1 this week at 28.5 points. And then you look a little bit further down the board, the Arizona Cardinals are still projected to score 20.5 points as well based off the spread and the total there. So I think that this is a game where Arizona's defense, again, bottom 5, maybe the worst defense in the league last season. And we're talking about a game that could easily go back and forth. Matt Milano out at linebacker for the Bills. They might be struggling on defense to start out the season. Then you throw in the fact that Cardinals are starting to look really good and really healthy, at least coming into the year with Kyler Murray. You add Marvin Harrison into the mix. James Conner's fully healthy. Led the league in missed tackles forced per attempt last season. He's showing no signs of slowing down at his age as long as he's in the lineup and good to go. So I think there's some sneaky junk time, garbage time potential, even if the Bills are to cover this spread and the Cardinals are just trailing the entire second half. We're going to see Kyler Murray drop back to sling it a ton. You're going to see some checkdowns for James Conner and specifically for James Cook. I think in week 1, we've got a lot of new weapons for Buffalo where, Dalton Kincaid, second-year tight end, rookie Keon Coleman, free agent addition Curtis Samuel. Who's been in that system the longest? It's really James Cook at this point after Stephon Diggs left in free agency to Houston. So I think the matchup on the ground first, and then the fact that in week 1, the Bills are probably going to be less inclined to use the backup rookie running back they have in Ray Davis. While I'm bullish on Ray Davis as a handcuff stash in managed leagues in the future, I think he could be a possible starter down the road. In week 1, I'm going to be all in on James Cook. And maybe I might, if we see Ray Davis get a mix in more than we thought, and Cook still scores a decent amount of fantasy points, Dalton, you know me, I might look to sell high on James Cook after week 1. But for at least in this matchup to start the year out, I think he's going to be the focal point of the offense there in week 1 against the Cardinals. And same goes on the other side for James Conner against the Bills here.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking down the list, another name that really sticks out like a sore thumb when I look at your fantasy rankings, Kyren Williams. Obviously, he's been in the news quite a bit after being named the Rams punt returner. I don't think very many people expected that, but Kyren Williams all the way down at number 15 for you this week, 7 spots behind his ECR mark of 8. I know obviously we're expecting offense in that Rams-Lions game. What is it about Kyren Williams that makes him unattractive to you in that matchup? Yeah,
I mean, look, I'm going to be wrong in some things, and this is one I could certainly be wrong on. I think RB15 is not too bad, to be honest, because if you've got a running back ranked RB15, you're probably starting them, right? Because if you start 2 running backs every week, ideally you're going to have one running back who's ranked 1 through 12, and your RB2 is going to be ranked somewhere between 13 and 24. So what I'm doing is I'm ranking Kyren Williams as a high-end RB2. He was drafted as an RB1. So I'm not saying to bench him. Don't get me wrong here. I've got him sandwiched in between James Conner, Josh Jacobs, and Isaiah Pacheco, and I told you how much I like James Conner. However, I've got him 7 spots below consensus because I think that Blake Corum is too pro-ready to just leave on the bench to start out the season. Sean McVay traded up in the draft to get Corum. Corum is your prototypical workhorse back. He hits the holes. He takes what's given in front of him. He doesn't do anything fancy. And Kyren Williams, as great as he is, he's an undrafted running back. Blake Corum has the draft capital of a round 3 pick. They said they're going to play Kyren Williams at I believe it's punt return and the other one at kick return. So they're both going to be returning kicks at some point. I think that goes to show they want to get the ball in Blake Corum's hands. So I'm kind of doing my best to be like, you know what? I of course I believe Kyren Williams is going to start the year as a starting running back. I think there's a non-zero chance, Dalton, that even without an injury to Kyren, there worlds exist in fantasy where Blake Corum could just take the starting job from him or force a 50-50 committee sooner than we want to think, even as a rookie when both guys are healthy. So it's me kind of starting to hedge towards that. I mean, look, if week 1 goes along and Kyren gets 30 touches and Blake Corum touches the ball 5 times or less, I'll make adjustments and I'll make sure Kyren's back into my top 10 firmly. But I think RB15 is kind of a good enough middle ground to where, you know what, I don't think he's going to get the super elite workload, 90% snaps he got last season. And I do think Blake Corum will mix in and take some of that upside away, but he's still a starting fantasy running back for now. And it's just really a situation to monitor, especially if you've got Blake Corum sitting on your bench as a future upside league winner in the playoffs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Two other guys I want to touch on with you too, because they really stick out to me as guys that it seems that you're telling people to bench, and that's DeAndre Swift with Chicago. You have him all the way down at 25. That's 14 you have him at 39, 14 spots below his consensus at 25. And then Ezekiel Elliott, who was seemingly named the starter today in Dallas, you have him down at 51 as opposed to his ECR mark of 38. Talk to me about some of these other guys who you're fading this week from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point with DeAndre Swift. The Bears had a lot of money to spend in free agency, right? And they went out and signed Swift. They wanted an explosive playmaker in the offense. We're not really sure what his workload is going to be. With DeAndre Swift, he struggled in a lot of efficiency metrics last year with his red zone efficiency, getting tackled very easily. Those numbers have been declining for the last couple of years. It's why you've seen him kind of jump ship from Detroit to Philly. Philly kind of let him go early, let him come here to Chicago. And Chicago still has 2 other bigger, more physical backs who have been in the system longer, who have some upside in Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson. So I think that Swift will have some explosive plays here and there on the ground. However, you're talking about a quarterback who's underrated in terms of his mobility and Caleb Williams. So we know the more mobile a quarterback is, the more he's going to scramble and the less he's going to check down and throw to his running backs. Then you add in the fact that we have an extremely crowded pass-catching core in Chicago with DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, the rookie. You got 2 tight ends running on the field with Gerald Everett and Cole Kmet in this now Shane Waldron-led offense. So for me, I had the kind of the cherry on top here that Tennessee has a really nasty defensive line. That's one thing they do well. You can beat Tennessee through the air, but they've been very stout on the ground pretty consistently over the last few seasons. So I think, again, with this pretty below average offensive line in Chicago, I think at least to start the year off against a better, more superior defensive line in that sense, right? I think Chicago's maybe a little less than mediocre there. I just don't know if DeAndre Swift is going to get the efficiency we're looking for. So I'm going to move him below guys like a Chuba Hubbard at the Saints, the explosiveness of a Jaleel McLaughlin. I like Tony Pollard, Najee Harris, those types of guys who I know are going to touch the ball pretty much the same amount or maybe even more than DeAndre Swift. And I think they have better matchups. They have better offensive lines in front of them in certain cases in terms of who they're playing against. So those are multiple reasons why I'm lower on DeAndre Swift this week. And I'm still not sure he's going to actually be the starting running back in terms of who finishes the game with more carries, Khalil Herbert or DeAndre Swift. That's a wait and see for me. So I'm kind of hedging on that coming out of the gates here. And with Zeke, man, if I want to be wrong on anybody and be totally okay with being wrong on them, it's Zeke Elliott, right? Like the matchup is brutal against Cleveland. I'm not surprised that they named Zeke the starter. For the same reasons, I'm not surprised why New England named Jacoby Brissett their starting quarterback. Like, start out the year in a very tough matchup with a subpar offensive line. Get the veteran out there. Don't throw your younger player into the fire. I think at the end of the day, we're going to see Rico Dowdle average a healthy amount more per carry than Zeke. And even if these guys are in a 50-50 committee, I think we're very happy to be Rico Dowdle owners in this case because he's the younger player. He's the most explosive player. I think he's going to do better in the passing game as well. And he got all the positive buzz needed in terms of coach quotes during the offseason. So Zeke Elliott at this age, coming off a season where he barely averaged 3 yards per carry in New England, I'm sorry, man. Like, I'm just going to pass. I ranked 60 running backs this week. I'm probably going to rank about that much every week. So just because I know he's going to be in there, I had to rank him. But I'm just trying to rank him low enough to where you don't even consider him for week 1. And if we're wrong, we're wrong. But in this matchup, in these circumstances, this isn't the Zeke from 5 years ago. This isn't rookie Zeke. Like, this is a different player. It's just the same name attached to his jersey. So I'm avoiding that at all costs for week 1.
Yeah, I've got Rico Dowdle in a few. I don't have Zeke in any, and I think it's just hard for me to imagine Zeke producing the kind of explosiveness we saw from him several years ago now. Let's move on to wide receivers. Obviously a ton of, like, just from a sheer volume perspective, right? We have a ton of wide receivers out there to talk about. I just want to hit on a few who, you've got some big discrepancies on, right? First one that sticks out to me in a positive way, Tank Dell. You've got Tank Dell all the way up as your wide receiver 16 going into week 1. Consensus on him is closer to 32. You've been beating the Tank Dell drum all offseason with, it seems that you firmly believe he's the number 2 guy behind Nico Collins. Talk to me a little bit about Tank Dell and why you like him so much week 1.
Yeah, I love the matchup for the Texans, man, coming into week 1 against this Colts secondary that was absolutely shredded last year. And I'm betting on that to continue again. With these Houston Texans being on the road, I think that might force them to drop back a little more, where they might be more proclined to build an early lead at home as opposed to on the road. So that's another reason why I like this. Good projected game pace in terms of the amount of snaps and plays that are being projected from both offenses right now. And look, man, like when Tank Dell was healthy last year, he was top 10. So you could say I'm being light on this ranking here at 16. He looked good in the preseason. Like, he caught a touchdown, had a couple nice plays. That's enough for me. Like, I'm not going to bet on guys that get hurt, especially when they're that young. If he was dealing with like a nagging hamstring injury, I'd be a little more hesitant. All reports are that the surgery went well. He had long enough to recover, and he's back. And hopefully they don't give him the ball at the 1 yard line like they did last year and have his small frame get beat up on by opposing defensive linemen, right? So, I got Nico Collins, my wide receiver 5, right? Like, you're starting Nico Collins no matter what. I've got Nico Collins above CeeDee Lamb, Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua. Like, that's how big I am on Nico Collins coming out of the gate. I think if all things go right, we could truly see both these guys end up as top 10 fantasy wide receivers this season. So those are the 2 guys I'm highest on in that range. And then I'll throw 2 other guys in terms of the matchup, like these pass funnel secondaries where, these defenses are built to stop the run and not the pass. It's more the opposite there. And Malik Nabers against the Vikings, pass funnel secondary. DJ Moore against the Titans, pass funnel secondary for Chicago as well, which is why I'm higher in their pass catchers than I am via DeAndre Swift, like we talked about earlier. So those are some guys I think I want to separate myself and put stances on in week 1 to where if I'm like struggling, like, oh, he's going to make my flex, is he going to be my wide receiver 2 or 3? Those are guys that I want to bet on at the end of the day where the talent profile is there, the youth, the speed, the upside, and then the matchup's the cherry on top. And I'm going to push those guys up a couple more spots than I would in terms of the expert consensus rankings across the industry right now.
3 guys who I'm looking at here that I saw taken in the 2nd round, maybe 3rd round of a lot of drafts that it looks like you have outside of wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 range going into week 1. Chris Olave, you've got him all the way down at 26, 13 spots below consensus. Michael Pittman Jr., you've got all the way down at 29, 11 spots behind consensus. And Drake London, you've got all the way down at wide receiver 30, 14 spots below consensus. those are all players at home, but certainly some tough defensive matchups, especially for Drake London with Pittsburgh. But what makes these guys that you're not so sure deserve consideration above a flex?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are guys where it's okay to have them as your wide receiver too. I think the ceiling's capped a little bit. I think once we get to wide receiver 18, 19, 20, the tier starts to flatten out. I've got, for example, I have T. Higgins as my wide receiver 20 right now. I might bump him down a little bit now that it's looking more and more confident Jamar Chase is going to be a full go for week 1. But then you go from T. Higgins to DK Metcalf all the way down to, let's say, Terry McLaurin at wide receiver 33. A lot of these guys are pretty close in the projections overall in terms of what we expect in target share, in their quarterback efficiency, in their matchups. So I'm a little bit lower. Like you said, the matchups are a little bit tougher in terms of the defensive backs that Houston has for Michael Pittman, the defensive backs that Carolina has that are a little underrated in my opinion. So those are reasons why I'm pushing those guys down the board. And with Chris Olave at wide receiver 26, don't get me wrong. I like Olave. If I got him, I'm going to start him. It's probably rare that my team is that loaded, right? Unless you're talking about 8 to 10 team, more casual leagues. If you're playing in a 12-team league, you're going to start those guys. But what I will say is that, I still kind of like Chris Godwin's matchup a little more. I still kind of like DK Metcalf, Keenan Allen's matchup. I like the 49ers guys still, even in a tougher matchup. I like Debo more than Olave. So it's a very talented top 30, 35 guys. We'd even talk about the guys playing tonight who are having good games in Xavier Worthy, in Rashee Rice, in Zay Flowers. So I think if you've got any of those top 35, 36 wide receivers, you're feeling confident. It's going to be difficult to rank them accurately from week 1 on, or even in week 1 alone. But we're going to get more data points to feel more confident about this kind of flat tier that we're seeing in this spot right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a ton of sense. Let's talk about tight ends. Obviously with tight ends at the top, it's pretty well, there's a pretty strong consensus that the top 3 guys are Laporta, McBride, and Kelsey. I feel like you'll see a lot of different ideas on what the order would be. ECR actually had Andrews at number 3 coming into this week. Not looking so great at the moment. But a couple guys that I noticed you're way high on. You've been high on David Njoku since the offseason. I mean, I've heard you talk about him quite a bit. And then it looks like, it seems like you're quite a fan of Noah Fant this week as well for somebody looking for a little bit more of a desperate start. You've got Fant all the way up at 13 when ECR has him at 21. Talk to me about some of your favorite tight end matchups this week. Yeah,
I mean, we got less guys to talk about here. We know who the top guys are. I tell you what, man, I'm not feeling great about I have a team where I have Mark Andrews and Trey McBride on a dynasty keeper team. You were in that league last year, and I started Mark Andrews above McBride. I'm not feeling great about that right now, but those guys are both top 5 guys, so you're going to feel good about either one, regardless of what the results say, at least for now, right? Move out. I got Njoku top 5 because, frankly, I just think that he was the number 1 tight end in fantasy points per game last year from week 8 on. What are we doing here? Dalton Kincaid, I've got him right in line with consensus. Dalton Kincaid is still not guaranteed to be the 90% snap guy that we're looking for as a tight end. They still like Dawson Knox a lot there. They've got a lot of other receivers in Buffalo. So, Evan Ingram, not, with the new additions they made in Jacksonville with the receivers there with Gabe Davis, Brian Thomas, the rookie, these are guys where I see Njoku and I see a guy where, if Watson's healthy, he's going to benefit. And if Watson's somehow hurt and his shoulder's messed up, he's just going to throw shorter passes to Njoku. And Njoku was the team leader in red zone targets last year as well. So to me, he's a clear starter over those. Outside the top 4, I think there's a consensus top 4, as you know. It's Laporta, McBride, Kelsey, and Andrews, right? The 2 young guys and the 2 old veterans. And then I got Njoku 5. And a little bit further down the board, I think Dallas Goedert's got some upside in Philly in a positive matchup Friday night against Green Bay. Obviously with the new offensive coordinator there, I think we could see some upside with Kellen Moore calling the plays where they really struggled the second half of last season throwing the ball. I think Dallas Goedert's going to stand to benefit in that scheme there. And then you look at some other guys, further down the board. I think there's some sneaky upside in a Taysom Hill. He was pretty much the second running back, goal line back for New Orleans during training camp. And with Alvin Kamara struggling so much on the ground, man, like Taysom Hill becomes like a 10-plus carry, 3-4 target guy a week. He's a guy we're going to be ranking pretty much top 10 every week given the current landscape. And as you know, like I've always been higher on Noah Fant as a later round tight end guy. It's kind of like if you're desperate type of thing. If you've got, guys like maybe you got Kyle Pitts in a tough matchup against the Steelers. Maybe you've got Brock Bowers, the rookie, in a bad situation in week 1 that's not really clear yet. I'm lower on Pat Freiermuth. Like those are guys I've got Noah Fant above. He's my highest drafted guy in best ball this year out of about 150 or so teams that I drafted. So I'm okay as long as he's fully cleared and healthy by Sunday. Don't get me wrong; he's still on the injury report. As long as he's cleared, I'm confident on him as like a fringe. Like, hey, I don't have a top 10 tight end, but I need to pick up a waiver guy because Kyle Pitts is banged up right now and he's not going to play. In those kind of break glass in case of emergencies, I'm perfectly okay going to an upside play like a Taysom Hill or a Noah Fant in week 1.
Yeah, and a couple guys I was going to ask you about, you already hit on them, right? The 2 guys it seems like you're much lower than the market on. Kyle Pitts, he's sitting there at number 8 in ECR. You've got him all the way down at 17. Brock Bowers, number 12 in ECR. You've got him all the way down at 19. Those are guys that are going to start in a lot of leagues that it sounds like you don't think should be starting in very many leagues.
Yeah, the injury news this week coming out with Kyle Pitts has not been the greatest. It's looking like he's going to play. But we haven't really heard indications that he's over the knee injury that really cost him a lot of efficiency in efficiencies departments last year. So I'm a little bit worried about that. They still have Drake London. Kirk Cousins, aging quarterback coming off a very serious injury as well. So I think there's enough red flags to me where I don't trust Pittsburgh's offense, obviously, but I trust their defense, especially in week 1, to have this be a kind of low-scoring, grinded-out defensive type of battle. I think Atlanta's defense is pretty good as well. So I would bank on less points than normal in that game specifically, where I'm going to bump those guys down the board a little bit, maybe outside the running backs. So that's why I'm lower, continued on these guys. And then Pat Freiermuth, I think, we saw Arthur Smith. Like, look, you can say at the same time, Arthur Smith loves to use his tight ends, but tight ends plural. For real life, it's great. For fantasy, not so great. We saw it with last year in Atlanta. Kyle Pitts would be on the field. You'd be like, oh, yeah, Kyle Pitts. You see an Atlanta tight end catch a touchdown, and it's Jonnu Smith. It's McCole Pruitt. And McCole Pruitt's back in Pittsburgh, by the way. They've got 4 tight ends they might suit up with on Sunday. So I'm a little bit worried about that. I want to see what the snap counts, the route counts are for Pat Freiermuth after week 1. The talent is there. Like if Pat Freiermuth if he was Travis Kelce's replacement in KC, he'd be my favorite tight end in the league. But it's just the situation he's in really when it comes to Freiermuth. So that concerns me and why I'm bumping him down just for week 1. If you got him on your bench, keep him there. Don't drop him yet. Wait and see what happens. He can always be a reliable option down the road if things start to break right for him.
All right. Well, we'll quickly go through defenses and kickers. DST, obviously, this is a position that I think you firmly believe in. I do too. You should mostly be streaming every single week and not really putting stock in a team over time. For this week in particular, what sticks out to me immediately, the New Orleans Saints are number 2 in ECR with their matchup at home against the Carolina Panthers. You've bumped them all the way down to number 13. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that and also just about your general thoughts on defenses this week you like most.
Yeah, I was doing that last night, and I kept moving them down a little bit here and there. I think that I'm trusting that Bryce Young is going to be a little better, at least in week 1. I trust in Dave Canales more than anything that he's going to have his guys ready to go with a better game plan than they had all of last season. I'm a little bit lower on the Saints than most people are this season as well. I think they could finish last in that division, whereas I think Carolina is good. I mean, any team is good enough to win the division. We kind of all know that. So maybe Carolina's a sneaky team. I think that the one team might be a little underrated. One team might be a little overrated. And those are the kind of the reasons why I wanted to put the Saints in a place where you could still start them if you needed to. Like they're number 12, 13. Like that's a borderline starter. I just didn't think the ceiling was as high as other people think in the industry. I want to bet against Jacoby Brissett / Drake May, rookies who can turn the ball over, teams with bad offensive lines. So that's why the Bengals, it's not just me, the entire industry has the Bengals defense number 1. I'm a Bengals fan. If you've listened to me, you know that. Like the Bengals don't have the best defense in the league by any stretch of the imagination, but they're number 1 for a reason this week. I want to bet against Will Levis. He was a turnover machine last year. He chucks it all over the field. I want to bet against Daniel Jones, which is why I have the Vikings 3, the Bears 2. I want to bet against Bo Nix as a rookie on the road in week 1, at least for week 1. I want to bet against Gardner Minshew on the road against Los Angeles. I want to bet on some of these pass rushes that can get after inexperienced quarterbacks who have been turnover prone in the past, who have suspect offensive lines in front of them. So that's my top 5 in terms of the Seahawks, Chargers, rounding that out. I like the Falcons a little more than consensus against as of now, we don't even know if Russell Wilson's going to be playing on Sunday. If we get Justin Fields in there, I'm going to like Atlanta even more as a defensive streamer. So after week 1, look at the week 2 matchup. If it's not one of those matchups, drop your defense, add a backup running back handcuff lottery stash to your bench, drop your kicker, stream those week to week based off the matchups. You're most likely going to be in a league where you have the bench spots, where there's going to be a lot of options out there every week. You can start planning ahead once you get closer to the playoffs and start stashing a defense a week or 2 early, but not now. We don't need to do that this early in the season. We don't know how those things are going to shake out. So that's why I have my rankings the way they are right now. And that's my general strategy going into drafts, and then also just going into week 1 in the regular season grind, as usual.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm certainly glad to hear that you feel that way about that Saints Carolina game. Carolina +4 is my biggest position of the week. So Love that.
I like that.
As far as kickers, I know talking fantasy kickers is your favorite thing in the world to do. So try to keep it short for me. I mean, look, we're to some extent, as I see it, you're kind of gambling with kickers, right? You're playing roulette. Sure. You don't really know. I think you typically want to target a game with a high total, maybe a game that's indoors, not in crazy weather. Just looking at your rankings, one guy that really sticks out to me, Joshua Carty, the rookie for the Rams out of Stanford. You've got him all the way up at number 8, consensus number 20 on him. Any thoughts at all on kickers, this week?
Yeah, if you listen to this show last year, my friend Tony Cavallo was the host, and we always kind of joked around with the kicker section. It was like winner, kicker dinner. We don't know who's it going to be. It's going to be pure luck. No one knew who Brandon Aubrey was last year with the Cowboys, but we all knew he was the Cowboys kicker. So it was insert name, Cowboys kicker here. I've got him top 5. And he wound up being the number 1 kicking tight end in fantasy by a lot last year. One name to throw on your radar. And this is look, Dalton, you mentioned it earlier, was a great point. Pull up not just the spreads and the totals, pull up implied team totals. If you've got an over-under of 48.5 and the spread's 7, well, that means one team's going to be projected for a lot more points than the other one, even though it's a high total in general for the game, right? So this is how I do my rankings. I'm looking at the implied team totals. Anyone with projected 24 and above, they're in my top 10 or 12 tier 1. Any teams projected around 20 points per game, they're in that middle tier 2. Teams projected for lower than that, they're in my bottom 10/tier 3. So that's kind of how I look at it in terms of my kicker tiers for the week. One name to keep in mind, Don, I know you watch a lot of college football. I've never heard the name until last night of Braden Narvison, but apparently he is the Green Bay Packers kicker heading into week 1, and he's going to be kicking in Brazil. I don't know, is the altitude there going to change things, make things easier or harder? I have no idea. But I like Green Bay and that offense. I like the matchup they have. And I've got him as my kicker 12. Just for those reasons alone, I don't care what the name is on the back of the jersey.
Yeah, Braden Narvison, interesting guy. Played at Iowa State for 2 years, played at Western Kentucky for 3 years, and finished his career at NC State. I'll go ahead and out myself, Chris. I don't know a whole lot about Braden Narvison. So apparently the Packers like him. Yes. We'll see what happens there.
Exactly.
That'll do it for the Week 1 fantasy football show here on the North Shore Drive podcast. We're going to learn a lot this week. We're going to learn a lot more than we are going to learn any other week. So don't be afraid to make bold moves, but also try not to overreact. My Twitter is @DaltonOnSports. You can find Chris Dell @MaddJournalist. That's MADD Journalist. Come check us out on Twitter. Yell at us, whatever you want to do. And we look forward to speaking with you next week. Chris, any last thoughts?
No, man. Check out the rankings at Post-Gazette.com. I'll have my weekly fantasy favorites column both on the website, either Saturday or Sunday. It'll always be in the Sunday newspaper as well if you're subscribed to either or both. And during next week, we're going to restart the Fantasy Fallout waiver wire early week waiver rankings and cheat sheet that I was doing last season. So we'll have the early waiver wire article as soon as the games are over Monday night. I'll have my rankings posted midweek, which is when we're going to start doing this show after week 1. We'll have the show plus my midweek top 200 rankings. Those rankings, by the way, I update every day. So if you check back in the site 6 hours later, you might notice a couple changes based off injury reports and things like that. And then come the weekend time will be more or less my overall strategy column, different thoughts on different players I'm higher or lower on by the end of the week. So it's always a moving ship with these types of things, but I think we've done the prep, we've done the research. We at least feel good about week 1, Dalton. I'm excited to do the show with you here. We're in a couple leagues together. We're not playing each other week 1 yet, but we will be arch rivals at some point in the future on this show. So I'm looking forward to that too, man.
Yeah, it'll definitely be a lot of fun. I'm glad. Honestly, I think week 1 would be the best time for me to possibly face you. So I'm kind of bummed I'm not. But all right, well, we will talk to everybody next week. Thanks for tuning in.
All right, good luck.